Hello, and welcome back to Laurence Plays Factorio Planetary Pioneers. And after a bit of gallivanting around the solar system, I thought it'd be nice to take a bit of a step back and have a look at some of the little changes that have been happening on lots of the other planets while we've been off exploring new territory. And so, along those lines, the first thing we're going to take a look at is how things are being brought back to Nauvis now, because that's changed quite a lot since I last talked about it. Here, Sophia has made some big changes to the input logistics system. We've now got our landing pad tucked in here, and we actually don't. Well, we do have a load of storage on it, but in theory we don't need it, because anything that lands in there is going to be immediately taken out. Because we've put the landing pad now, rather than being over in the science area, because we thought that nearly everything that was being brought in was science, and then dealing with that as it comes in. Instead, we've now got that as part of the main interplanetary logistics system in this block here, which, as you can see, is on a separate roboport network from the main rest of the factory. You can tell that because the orange areas are not linked. They're very, very nearly linked over here, but they're not quite. So this is a separate roboport area. And that means when a spaceship arrives and unloads a load of stuff, it goes into the landing pad here, and then is dumped into these purple chests almost immediately and taken away to wherever it's wanted. Science packs are brought, as you can see, down from the purple chest and put into the chests down here. So we're seeing a load of steam science being brought in at the moment. And we're trying to keep a stockpile of all of the different science packs available here in the landing area. And we've got a display along the top here that shows us how many of them we've got. And these are in thousands. So we've got 38,000 steam science. We've got 40,000 space science, which is the target. We're trying to have 40,000 of each one. There's a bit of a shortage of the Vulcanus science and a little bit of a shortage of the Fulgoran one. We're going to have to deal with those. Castra is a bit of a struggle, but then we've only just started that one, so that's okay. Exploration science coming over from Muluna is also doing very, very well. We've got a bit of a shortage of corundum and a plentiful supply of the Igrian science, so things are generally doing pretty well, although there are a few science packs that are either new enough or have had some issues, and so we're going to need to take a bit of a look at those. From here, we can then take those away by train, and we have a system down here that works in more or less the same way as the disposal system for excess amounts of junk that might turn up in the logistics network around here. And we talked about that a few months ago. We have a system over here where we're bringing in stuff that's needed by the production systems over here, because this is our mall area where we're producing all of the buildings and things that we need. And then an additional station over here that will take away any excess that builds up. So, for example, if we did a massive deconstruction frenzy, we could end up with a load of wood in this area, and this will allow that to be taken away. Similarly, over here, when we need science packs, they can be brought over from here down to this station by bot, and the right number will be put into each of these blue chests, and if there's any excess, it'll be taken out into the purple chests. And that means it can then be picked up by a train and taken away to the science area, where Tristan has been fixing up the science processing, and these science packs then get dropped in at the top here. So this is working in roughly the same way that we used to have it for the other sciences that were being made on Nauvis, but now we've expanded that out to bring in all of the different science packs through this method. They're dropped off in a station up here at the top, and then we have a system up here that's monitoring what's in the station and then randomising that, so picking one type of science pack that's in there, and that means we should be shuffling what's being dumped out along this belt. And you can see it down here. We've got a decent spray of different colours of science packs coming through here, and the theory behind that is it means that then down here, when they reach these inserters, we won't have a solid belt of, say, blue science coming in, because when we do, it jams up just like this, because the inserter is fairly limited. Even though we've upgraded it to a rare inserter, it's still not quite fast enough to chuck these science packs into the boxes as fast as they're coming in along the belt, if the belt's running flat out. And so having the randomizer in there means that they're shuffled a bit, and so hopefully we'll get a mix of different types of science pack coming in and make sure the inserters are able to keep up. And they mostly are. You can see this belt is running fairly smoothly. It does stutter a little bit like that from time to time, but mostly it's running quite well. And we've improved this a little bit quite recently, because Tristan has made these belts along here a little bit longer, which means there's a bit more buffer. And so if we get a brief burst of quite a lot of one type of science, then it can be absorbed into this belt and then dealt with before the next burst of that type of science pack comes through. And as you can see, it's working pretty well. We are getting basically a green belt of science coming in here, and since the system is designed so that we can have up to a green belt of science coming out along here to be fed back into the system, this means that in theory we should always have enough capacity here to keep this maintained and keep this filled up, especially sometimes the science isn't running quite flat out. At the moment it looks like we're trying to use a lot of the Castra science, for example, so that's struggling a little bit, but there's a little bit of topping up going along here. The previous version of this system also had the feedback belt going into the Sortimatron at the top, and we've decided that that's a bad idea, because whilst it does mean you can make sure you're getting a nice even spray of everything coming out of the bottom quite easily through just having a system of lots and lots of splitters joining it all back up again, it means you've then got far too much science trying to be fed in at the top, maybe even 2 or 3 belts worth of everything going in, and so that just doesn't work. However, with this being just looped back round like this, it works very nicely, and we're not trying to pass all of that back through again, so we should have a decent amount of headroom available on there. In order to make sure that the right types of science are being fed back out onto the belt and we can keep doing all of the science that we want to, we're monitoring how many science packs are on the entire system, I think, by the looks of it. And then we've got a machine over here where we've set a number, which is 180, and then we're feeding that along to all of these belts along here, where we're saying enable the belt if the amount of that particular science pack on the whole belt system is less than the amount that we're aiming for, which is 180. So we can tweak that number and reset all of these very, very quickly and easily. And all of these will then dump science packs onto the belt whenever there's a shortage of them. But if there's an excess of them, then they won't. So that works very, very nicely and keeps us at a steady state. Now, I did express some concern that we'd have a problem with this dumping it all on, and it'd be very, very bursty. So we'd have all of the red science packs stuck together, for example, because we'd filled the belt up and then the system was just allowed to run. But it was pointed out to me that this actually probably isn't going to be an issue, because if we're actually using those red science packs, then they'll be taken off all the way down through here. And so as they're being used up, we'll be dumping more onto the belt, so there'll be a steady flow of them. And the only time we could end up with that sort of bunching up effect happening is if we're not using that science pack at all, at which point it doesn't actually matter. So yes, this seems to be a very good system, and well, most of the time you can see that virtually all of the labs are working. I think at the moment, I don't know, is it the Castra? Yes, the Castra science is the one we're short of. When we're doing a research that only uses science packs that we have plenty of, and I think we've just had some Castra ones delivered, you can see that basically all of the labs are running. They're all very, very happy, and we're able to do our science at the sort of the 300 and something per minute that we're getting used to. And so, yes, I think Tristan has done a good job of fixing up the science system up here and making sure that everything is going to carry on working nicely. It's fixed a lot of the problems we're seeing with the old system, although I do still have a slight concern about the rate we're bringing the science in along here. However, as I said earlier, that because we can't put new science into the system any faster than one green belt, and I've basically never seen this belt running absolutely flat out, the fact that we are able to, in theory, put one green belt's worth of science into the system means that we should basically be okay. The only problem is when we have a bit too much of one particular type of science pack coming in, and it does jam up along one side of the belt, which it's not doing at the moment. Like you've seen it do a little bit in the past, but at the moment it seems to be working pretty well. Oh, there we go, it's jammed up on the space sciences. So you can see the problem that we can potentially run into. But most of the time it's pretty good, and I think and having the random unloader on the station over here sorts it out very nicely and makes things work more or less as they should. And so back over to the downstream area where all of our products are being brought in from space. I've mentioned how we're dealing with the science, and everything else is dealt with in more or less the same way. So if we bring in a load of foundries from Vulcanus, they'll be grabbed out of the purple chest by bot, brought over to here, stored in one of these chests somewhere. There they are, I can see them there in that box. And we've got diagonal inserters over here, large crushers and large drills over here, and so on with anything that we're bringing in from another planet. So those are all stored in here, and if there's something like tungsten, which we need for building other things from, then they can be taken from here down into the mall area and used for building. If, however, they're buildings, like a foundry, and they need to be used somewhere else in the factory, because we do like using foundries around here for making things like these more efficient iron processing facilities, then we have the system over here that I've mentioned before, where we've told the system that we want to have all of these things available for building outside in the factory. And we then convert those numbers into that many stacks, subtract the total number of items down here that we already have available for the factory building, and then pass that over divided by n to go into all of these blue chests, which means whenever we ask for something new, the bots will bring it over from the storage we've got in the mall area, dump it into these blue chests, and it'll be passed over and ready to be taken away for building. So you can see over here we have a load of landfill and bricks and rail and belts and some speed modules and so on and so on. All of these things are just brought over when they're required, and then they can be taken away by the bots and used to build up the rest of the factory. With an attempt to ensure we have enough bots to do this sort of thing, we have a lot of roboports over here, actually on both sides of the split. And yeah, that works quite nicely, but it does take a very, very long time to do some of the upgrades. I mentioned earlier that Tristan moved some belts around up here in the science area to extend this bit to put a bit more storage space in up here. And, well, the ripping stuff up happened very, very quickly because there were some bots in that general area. But then getting all of the new belts placed took rather a long time because they had to be flown from all the way down here up to here. Unfortunately, that's a problem that you just tend to have to deal with when you have an enormous factory like this one. We could sort it out by perhaps splitting it up into sections, like maybe we'd split this into 9 areas, a 3x3 grid of large Roboport areas, and then we could have a system where construction trains would bring a load of supplies from the mall area out and bring them out and put them in some blue chests up in the area up here, or some green chests up here, and that would allow us to then have some sort of system where things could be brought out most of the way by train, and then just the final part will be done by bot. That's certainly doable. We haven't bothered yet because at the moment it's easier just to be a little bit patient and wait for things to be built, and also we'd need to have quite a lot of stuff being brought out, and therefore we'd have a lot more resource just tied up sitting in chests, which isn't ideal, but I think at this stage we could probably afford that. However, it would require a certain amount of thought and effort to go through and build the upper system that would work like that would allow us to have everything that we need. It would be quite an interesting challenge though, so maybe it's something we'll do in the future. We shall see. There is one other thing that's brought into the landing pad over here, and that's the barrels of fluids that are required for science. So we're bringing in the Dream Concentrate and the magic fluid from Igrys, and those are coming in special types of barrels, well, barrels or special barrels, and they're being unloaded here by these filter inserters, and that's why these ones are filtered, and all of these ones are sort of anti-filtered, if you will. So when some magic fluid arrives like that, we can then dump it straight out onto the belts, and it comes around here, where it'll then get picked up by these inserters and go into these machines, where we can then dump that magic fluid out into some storage tanks along here, and then when we're ready, a train can come in here to grab that and take it away for making science. Because as we've discussed before, making science using the Igrian machines is much more efficient, and making it using the Cubium recipes is even more efficient, and so we'd like to do that where we can. Once the barrels have been emptied, they're then taken away by bot and stored somewhere down here, and then once we have enough of those to fill a rocket, once an Igrian spaceship is overhead, we can then dump those into a rocket over here, and then they'll be launched up and taken back to the ship to go back to Igrys for recycling, because the strong barrels are very expensive. The normal barrels, on the other hand, they're pretty cheap. They are just steel. So once we've taken the Dream Concentrate out of them, I assume we are then recycling them. Yes, down here, you can see the barrels being brought in here. They're being recycled, turned into steel, which is then just taken away and put into normal steel storage. And we can then, in theory, at least use that for building all the other things we build around here. We do have 9,000 steel due to this, but still, that's it's a lot, but also it's not an unmanageable amount. So we're okay with that at the moment. Those fluids can then be picked up from the station here and then brought over to a science area that's going to need them. So, for example, over here we have yellow science. And we have a station over here which is doing multiple fluid drop-offs. So we can have the magic fluid and the Dream Concentrate dumped into these tanks, and then it'll be pulled out by these filtered pumps into the appropriate tanks over here. I'm not quite sure how a filtered fluid pump works, but apparently it does, so we'll just go with that. Those fluids are then brought over to here, where we're using the Science Enhancer machines from Igrys to make everything a bit more efficiently. The basic way of using them is like this, where you get the standard 150% productivity bonus, so you get 2.5 science packs each time it runs, plus an extra 6% because we put a productivity module in there, because why not? And so you can see here, we've got a nice full productivity bar along the bottom there for the bonus production. And each time this recipe runs, you get 3 science packs, so for each set of inputs we're putting in there, we're getting just over 7.5 science packs out, so that's quite good. However, if you use the Cubium recipes, and that requires the Dream Concentrate as well, then you can do almost the same recipe in the same type of machine. However, this one takes in the same inputs plus some Dream Concentrate and produces 8 utility science packs from the standard recipe because of the Cubium bonus. That, coupled with the 156% bonus productivity, means we're producing just over 20 science packs each time this runs, which is almost 3 times as much as we're getting out of these machines over here. So that's very generous, and you can see why we like using these recipes. However, as I've discussed before, particularly with regards to Fulgora, it does rather throw off the balance of the game because you're able to make the science packs incredibly quickly and incredibly cheaply. So maybe we should have been playing with some sort of science cost boosting thing. I don't really know. I could see arguments either way, but it has thrown the balance of the game off a little bit, so we'll have to decide whether we want to do anything about that later. Or maybe we'll just try and charge headlong into some of the more advanced infinite researches that tend to use up absolutely enormous amounts of science packs. We shall see. On the subject of science, one of the additional techs we found out on Corundum is the pressure laboratory, and these are interesting. They are about twice as fast. You can see that's running at a research speed of 6.13, whereas these ones are at 2.8. And they also have a 30% science pack drain and a 30% productivity, so that sounds really absolutely fantastic. However, the problem with them is that they essentially require high quality science packs, so they have to be at least uncommon, if not better. And we don't have any of those being brought in. We're only making normal quality science. And if you put those into one of these machines, well, I can turn it on by flipping these inserters around. And you can see we're now putting these science packs in, but they're all just disappearing. Then it's not doing any science with it. You can see it's not doing any science at all down here. And that's because, as it says in the box text over there, if you put normal quality science packs into it, it will drain one every 0.75 seconds. So it essentially just eats all of your science packs and destroys them without doing any useful research. It also requires some steam to be fed into it in order to keep it running, which is an additional complication, but not a serious one. And so this machine is basically useless for what we want to do because we don't have the better science packs coming in, and so essentially it just destroys enormous quantities of science and is therefore very, very not worth doing. However, we could consider going around and putting productivity modules in all of our science production systems and then having filter systems on these, so telling these ones to only insert quality science packs and telling these ones to not insert quality science packs. That would then ensure that this one would never waste science packs, but on the other hand, I'm not sure whether we'd be bringing in enough quality science packs for it to run very often. And part of that is because we're using the Igrian Science Enhancer machines, and as we've seen when we've been looking at them before, these only have one module slot, so we'd only be able to put one quality module into it at the absolute most. So we'd have a relatively small number of higher quality science packs coming out. We'd then have to worry about all the hassle of transporting them, because they'd probably need to be transported separately because they wouldn't stack up nicely with the other ones. It's going to be a whole headache and a whole difficult thing that we don't really want to have to deal with. And so whilst this would allow us to get almost 4 times as much science out of each pack, plus probably the additional bonus that you get from using quality science packs anyway, the additional logistics to get this working are rather tricky, and so I'm not sure if it's worth it. Maybe this will be something we can try later on in the game when we want a slightly more advanced challenge to try and make things a bit more difficult. But at the moment, it just doesn't seem worth it. It was interesting to play with though, so, you know, I like finding these new toys, even when it turns out they're perhaps not the best thing we could find to use. While we were messing around on Nauvis, Saphir decided it'd be a good idea to implement some of the new toys we found, so he started building Spidertrons, and we've got a number of those. We've made 58 so far, crikey, that's a lot of Spidertrons, and we've got a few special ones along here, like this rare guy, and a couple of uncommon ones as well, so we've got some slightly better Spidertrons. We haven't really used them for very much yet. We've gone out and tested them and blown up a load of biters, but basically I don't think we've really had much need for them so far. He's also built up the Icebox, which is essentially a wooden chest with some plastic insulation. And these things are designed to keep, as it says, spoilables at up to 50% freshness. Now, they do have a rather specific list of things they can actually work with. They only work with bioflux, eggs, and agricultural science, but it does say it keeps them at 50% spoilage. So we're not quite sure what this means yet, because we haven't got any of those things. We did some testing with other things like fish and hot metals and a few other things like that to see if it would work on those, and it doesn't. It basically is as it says in the box text here, which is a little bit of a shame. But at some point, I suspect this might come in quite useful. We're curious to find out whether it's going to immediately take things to 50% spoilage and then hold them there, or whether it's going to prevent them from dropping any lower than that. We don't know that one yet. If you do know, please don't tell us, because we'd like to find out ourselves. But I think this could be quite useful for certain future things that are, well, listed in along here. We'll see how that works. But essentially, you freeze carbon dioxide, you need to make dry ice, you put that in the icebox with your things you want to keep healthy, and apparently it stops them spoiling quite so quickly. Making the dry ice is interesting because you require a lot of carbon dioxide, obviously, and you then also need some water that is no hotter than 21 degrees. And most of the time that's absolutely fine, because the water that we pump out of the lakes around here comes in at 15 degrees, so that's absolutely fine. That is less than 21 degrees. However, it then gives you the water back at 90 degrees, so if you then try and circulate that round, it will almost immediately be far too hot. So this needs to go in somewhere where there is a lot of water being consumed for something else, so maybe in a power station, or even in our mall area here where it's being used for making concrete. That's certainly a possibility, as long as you have something that can use up that 90 degrees water. And most things don't care how hot the water is. Concrete mix doesn't mind. You can put in water at whatever temperature you like, so 90 degrees, absolutely fine. But if you want to keep using it for making dry ice, you can't just keep circulating the same water. And we haven't found a system for chilling the water down yet. Maybe we will later, but at the moment it basically needs to be water that's been pulled fresh out of a lake. It can't have gone looped round and round a couple of times, and so we're going to need some sort of sink if we want to carry on making it in the same area. Marcus started building the proper mech armors as opposed to the prototype mech armor we were using before, and he stuck in a load of quality modules, which is fantastic because it means that some of the mech armors that come out will be slightly better than your average mech armor. They won't just be coming out at normal quality. My personal one, for example, is an uncommon, which is admittedly only tier 2, but it is slightly better. And that means I've got a bit more space in my inventory, I've got a bit more space in my equipment grid, and I was hoping that maybe it would have a little bit more health or resistances, but it doesn't seem to. It is just the inventory size and the equipment grid size, but then those are the most important things. And if we compare this with the prototype mech armor we were using before, you can see that it gives quite a sizable bonus to your equipment grid, which is very, very useful because it means you can have more shields, more legs, more all of that sort of stuff. It also has better resistances to both fire and physical damage, but other than that, it's pretty similar. So it's an upgrade, but not enormous leaps and bounds further. Both of them also allow you to fly, so again, no additional bonus there. I did find to my amusement that if you're wearing a mech suit, if you're running across concrete, you get the bonus from it. However, if you take off to fly, because perhaps there's a building in the way, then you immediately lose that bonus from the concrete, and so actually flying is suddenly slower than walking. This is the opposite of going across something like sand or snow, or some of the heavy oil lakes that you can run on, where you automatically take off and fly because you would run more slowly across it because you get your feet stuck in it than you are able to fly across it. So it's interesting to see that while concrete gives you a positive bonus and things like sand give you a negative bonus, those both only affect you when you're on the ground, which makes perfect sense. But it is slightly bizarre that you can run faster than you can fly. Maybe it makes sense, a sort of sense, but it still seems slightly weird. A little bit further over to the west, I set up a new city block to make low-density structures, and interestingly, this is using the old system for making them. So we're bringing in copper and steel as the actual plates, as well as, of course, the plastic that's needed for them, and then making them along here with sort of full productivity and full speed beaconing going on here. I say full speed beaconing, maybe with a bit of effort I could have got more of them in there, but it doesn't really matter. You can compensate quite nicely with additional machines if you need them. And then that's spitting out a quantity of low-density structures that's gone out and nicely filled up the station. And the reason we're doing this instead of making them in the other way we were doing before over here, where we're going from the molten metals, is because we have an enormous quantity of plastic available because we're using the Lignumis method of producing plastic, which means it's essentially free and infinite. It's not using up any of the oil around the factory. But we are potentially limited on the molten iron and copper because that's being made from the ores that are being brought in, and we seem to not have any molten copper at the moment. Maybe the station's been turned off. And so if you use the other recipe, if we use this recipe for making them, then we can put in more productivity into the system. So for example, for the copper, we're going from crushed copper, turning it into liquid copper here with a full set of productivity modules, then turning it into copper plates with another set of productivity modules, and then down here, we're turning those copper plates into low density structures with another set of productivity modules. However, if we were doing it the other way, then we'd have one set of productivity modules to turn it into the liquid copper. Sure, that we'd still have that, but then we'd be taking the molten copper away and bringing it down here, where we'd have a second set of productivity modules to turn it into the low density structures. And so that means we'd only have two sets of productivity modules instead of three, so we'd be using a bit more copper. This all assumes that the amount of copper taken up at each step is the same. So let's check that. Making it the traditional way, you use 20 copper plate, which means we'd be using 200 molten copper. If we make them the other way, then we're actually using 250 molten copper. So even without the productivity bonuses, the traditional way is still cheaper. Maybe this one is cheaper for plastic, let's check. So we're using 5 plastic to make one low density structure. Alternatively over here, we're using 5 plastic to make one low density structure. So it appears to actually be the same. So the foundry recipe is straight up worse than the assembly machine recipe. That really surprises me. I was expecting this one to be much, much better. What about the iron? So we're using 80 molten iron to make one, whereas we could use 2 steel plates, which would cost 60 molten iron. Okay, so it's slightly more expensive on the iron front, except that we've got the extra productivity bonus in there, so it probably isn't. Well, that was a lot of numbers. But this goes to show that the more advanced recipes aren't automatically better. It turns out in this particular case, this one, using the assembly machines, does seem to be just straight up better, especially as both machines will take 4 productivity modules. Otherwise, we'd see some slight differences here for the plastic and so on and so on. So that was an interesting one that Mark picked up on and then tasked me to go off and produce a more efficient method of making the low density structures using the lower tech. Moving away from Nauvis now, Lignumis is ticking over pretty nicely. I don't think we've really needed to do anything here. We've talked a little bit about trying to make blue circuits en masse over here, but we haven't really made any real progress with that, so it's just gradually producing quantities of steam science and shipping them out by rocket. It's ticking over quite nicely. Muluna has required some significant expansion, Tristan expanded the space science production over here, so it's now being made about twice as fast. And I think that was just done through copy and paste, and then a little bit of monitoring everything else to make sure things were behaving. And it turned out they weren't behaving, and so Mark put in some additional iron production, which is going to be over here somewhere. I'm going to guess it's this one down here at the bottom, because it's down at the bottom and therefore was probably put in last. But with this, it now seems to be working quite nicely. Although this is, interestingly, this seems to be taking in iron ore rather than crushed iron, like these ones are. So, oh no, it's crushing it on site. Never mind. Okay, that's quite neat. So it's bringing it in, then crushing it down here to pass up the middle, and then the iron can be taken away. So yeah, fine, that's working quite well. Mark also expanded the exploration science production. This is through the magic of copy paste as well, and has been rather over the top, and well, there's a lot of it, put it that way. And that's also meant that he's had to expand the rate that we're making the space crushers at. So he's taken the original system that Tristan built and pasted it in again and again and again and again. Blimey, so he's quintupled it by the looks of it. And so we now have rather a lot of space crushers. This is because when we're moving the science labs around, we had a lot of buffers that needed filling. You've seen that we're storing 40,000 of each science pack over on Nauvis, and so we wanted to fill that up. So there's a rather high demand on these science packs. So we started pulling those through a lot more quickly. And the big problem with this is that we can only produce the data here with this telescope at a certain rate, at just under 6 per second. And that isn't enough to run all of these machines along here, so it's a little bit inadequate. And so we were discussing putting telescopes out on other planets, because you can only have one per planet, and then bringing some more data in that way. But it caught up before we actually started to need it. And exploration science isn't needed in enormous quantities, or at least isn't needed in enormous quantities yet. And so we've not worried too much about this. However, we are aware that in the future we're going to start needing to put telescopes on other planets and then start bringing in data on the tapes to bring down here into this machine, which can copy the data off the tapes onto the cables, and then all of our assemblers along here can start making the exploration science a bit more effectively. The problem is that because the data cables count as pipes, you eventually run into the problem of the pipe being too long. So I guess it's just the latency on the data cable. And so that's why there's a gap up here. And so if we do end up needing all of these machines, or even more of them, then we're going to need to have another machine copying data off tapes up here, and then also another belt bringing the tapes up this way to go to that machine. So that's going to be a problem we'll solve when we actually need to. At the moment, we're aware of it, but we don't actually need to fix it just yet. Putting in all of these extra machines and the massive quantities of productivity modules we put in them has meant we're using rather a lot of power. So after a couple of brownouts, Tristan has put in another nuclear plant over here. It's a copy-paste of the one above. You won't be remotely surprised to discover. And that's producing another, presumably 160 megawatts of power, which is keeping the lights on and keeping everything running quite nicely. This one has been a little bit weird because we're pulling steam out of here to satisfy the plastic inflation for the exploration science packs, but basically it's running normally and quite nicely. It just wasn't quite enough for the requirements we had over here. And we've made 1 million green science packs. Lovely. Out on Igrys, the neat system that Mark put together, hanging on to the cermet for as long as possible before turning it into cermite so that it decays nice and quickly into the cooked cermite, or the ready to actually use cermite, was working really, really nicely. However, there was no limit to it to how long it would run for, and so the system filled up, and that meant that the cermet was decaying into steel in the box over here, which was a bit of a problem because we didn't want that, and so we were generating enormous quantities of steel, which was then being taken away by the bots and put into storage over here. So we had absolutely ridiculous amounts of steel, and we still have 70,000 of it. So we've pulled quite a lot of that out, as you can see. So Mark has now fixed these to stop them running when we have an excess of it. So he's monitoring the amount of cermite on the belt down here, and then translating that into, well, 100 cermets to tell the machines to stop. And that means if the machines are filling up with cermet, or if this belt is full of cermite, if there's more than 2,500 of it, that is, then all of these will shut down and stop running. And that means that we don't end up with silly amounts of steel, which is good because it was getting a bit ridiculous. In an attempt to fix that up a little bit, he's also put in some additional rocket silos over here that are pulling in that steel and then launching it up to the lime to be taken away to wherever else it might be needed, just as a way to to gradually take it away, because we've got plenty of resources here for making the rockets, so it's not a problem if we need to launch up a few extra ones. And finally, over on Cubium, the whole system shut down and we weren't able to launch any rockets, and that was a bit of a problem. And it turned out we'd run out of rocket fuel, and we followed it back, as you do, came over to here, and we weren't making any from here because we didn't have any liquid hope being brought in. I mean, okay, why do we not have any hope? Why are we hopeless? Came over here, it turned out this tank was empty, and this machine had stopped running where we're doing the emotional cracking because we'd filled up on disgust. So we were so disgusting we were actually hopeless. So I asked Mark to go in and fix it. He's done basically exactly what I would expect. He's we've got a feed of steel now coming in under here. It's being made into barrels. We're putting excess disgust into barrels and then dropping it onto a belt here where it can be then taken away and just dumped into the lava. So, you know, it's a simple way of getting rid of it. Steel is free on this planet. It's all made out of dreams and jelly and nonsense like that. And so it's fine to make the barrels from it, shove that into there and take it away. There are a couple of other recipes for disgust. So you can see here, we're putting it into a barrel. That's what we're doing. We're not doing titanium things yet. So you can do the anger reconstitution, which turns it into liquid anger, and we are doing a bit of that here, and that's allowing us to make a few other things. It gets passed on and on and on, and that does use up some of it. Oh yes, and that helps us use up the anger that's produced from the emotional cracking as well. So we've got a sink for that, but doesn't use up enough of the disgust. Now we can also turn it into spoilage, but that takes lots of the liquid hope as well. Now I think overall this would work. We could turn it into spoilage because we produce more hope from cracking than we produce disgust. We produce 55 liquid hope and we produce 35 liquid disgust, so we would have 20 left over. However, that feels kind of wasteful when it's just getting rid of a byproduct that we don't want to have, and we then end up with spoilage, which, well, we could burn it, I suppose, and use it for a bit of power. We could use it to re-energize a microcube, or we could just chuck it away into the lava. All these things are all a bit, well, why don't we just use some of this free steel and get rid of it in the liquid form? That seems much better. So there isn't really a good way of dealing with the disgust that makes me particularly happy. This is the best we've got, and so this is what we're using. And so I think that's enough talking for one episode. Thank you very much for watching. That gives you a little bit of catch up as what's been going on our first few planets. We haven't needed to do anything on Fulgora or Vulcanus recently, so there's nothing to say about those. So in the next couple of videos we'll take another look at Corundum and find out, because we've finished that one off now for certain values of finish. There's a little bit more to say about that one, and then we can go out and start talking about Castra, which is a wild and exciting new planet that we've done a little bit of playing with. I don't think we've seen everything it's got to offer yet, but we've made a little bit of a start. So if you'd like to see how we're getting on Castra, come along on Monday, 7:30 PM UK time to join in the fun live on stream. And if you fancy giving it a try yourself, then grab the Planetary Pioneers mod from the Factorio mod portal. That'll give you all of the planets we're playing with here. It's been updated now for all the new ones we've added in, and so you'll be able to have a bit of a look around and see everything we're playing with, and try your own hand at it. If you do give it a shot, let us know on the Discord server how you get on. I'll also be back on Wednesday for a bit more Foundry, where I'm building up all this sort of same Factorio stuff, but with a third dimension to play with, and some absolutely enormous buildings and some massive tunnels that I'm digging. So that's a lot of fun. I recommend coming along to see that, and these videos will be coming out every Thursday and Friday as well, so make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any of those. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.